I am a big advocate of group practices having a line of credit because emergencies will happen, right? Things will come up, and having a line of credit means that you're not going to the payday lenders of the small business for really, really expensive money, right? Where you have kind of this buffer, like, oh yeah, this payment didn't come through. We still have to make payroll, but the money will be here in a few days. But it's the backup and not the main plan.
Welcome to the Money Skills for Therapists podcast, where we answer this question: how can therapists and health practitioners go from money shame and confusion to feeling calm and confident about their finances and get money really working for them in both their private practice and their lives? I'm your host, Linzy Bonham, therapist turned money coach and creator of the course Money Skills for Therapists. Hello, and welcome back to the Money Skills for Therapists podcast. Today, we have returning guest, Julie Harris, the owner of Green Oak Accounting, an accounting firm that specializes in working with therapists, and also the author of Profit First for Therapists. And Julie and I are talking about this phrase today, this idea of moving at the speed of cash. We explore what that means to move at the speed of cash. What are some of the risks that can come with incurring large amounts of debts? Like, what has she seen happen when folks end up incurring too much debt? What does that mean? What does that look like? What's involved and needed to move at the speed of cash in your business? This is a phrase that Julie brought to me, and I just immediately got it and loved it. And this conversation too ended up spinning off maybe a little bit too far. We'll see what Ashley, our editor, leaves in, down a bit of a road of philosophically, what is actually worth it, right? And how do we actually get what we want? And when is that about money? And when is it not about money? Maybe challenging this idea that taking on debt or making big moves fast is actually going to get you what you want in your practice and your life. Here is my conversation with Julie Harris. Hi, Julie, and welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here, Linzy. I always enjoy our chit chats.
And I just noticed I really had the desire there to name you. I really wanted to say Julie Harris, which is obviously not how I refer to you when we speak one-on-one, but your name has become, since you wrote the book and you've been out there, like Julie Harris is like, you're a presence now. So Julie Harris.
Oh, well, thank you. I am here.
So I'm excited to chat with you today about something that it's something you had mentioned in a call that you did, I don't know, where are we at now? Like 6 months ago?
Yeah, probably.
With some of my students in Money Skills for Group Practice Owners, I believe, that I grabbed this phrase that you used because I was like, whoa, I love that idea. I have never heard it expressed like that. Can we please have a podcast and just jam on it? And that is this idea of moving at the speed of cash. It's a phrase that you just threw out casually as you do, while answering a question, but I think it's such a rich idea. So can you start by explaining this concept that you have of moving at the speed of cash and why you generally advocate for that over folks taking on debt?
Yeah. So I'm generally a fan of moving at the speed of cash because it is a way to pace yourself in business, right? I think as visionaries of a business, right? And often the owner is that visionary. There's always ideas, and there's often more ideas than you necessarily have the time or the money for, right? So there's always this kind of culling of the ideas and saying like, oh, I really do like this, but we're going to have to wait, right? Or yes, I could expand, right? If money was no object, you could probably expand your practice really, really quickly. Yes. And especially in the case of a group practice. But usually there is a restriction, right? That is a reality of most humans, that money is an object and you just don't have unlimited funds. And so moving at the speed of cash is this concept of, well, we're going to save up for things in advance and then be strategic in planning for them and then executing. And so when we do the thing, it's actually a lot less scary because we have already done the planning. Whereas debt can be really exciting and it's easy to get money now. It's more expensive these days than it was a year ago, but it's still pretty easy to get debt. And then I just think that often it's not thought through in the same way of like, oh, well, let's just, take some money from the line of credit and try this out. Versus if you have to spend a couple of months or even a couple of weeks planning ahead and getting the things ready, you're thinking through it and pausing to put some plans in place, and you might do things actually a little bit differently. It also feels a little harder to spend your own money.
I was just thinking that. Yes.
Yeah. And so where like, oh, it's the bank's money. Really, you're going to have to pay it back later, but it feels more personal since you're usually a little more judicious in your decision
Yeah,
making and spending money a little bit
totally.
differently.
It is way less sexy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I was thinking about
Not
that
as
exact thing.
exciting
And I
at
was just
all.
racking my brain. I was like, is it in Profit First that he talks about that idea of like angel investors and when folks have other people's money that they spend it faster? Is that Profit First that he talks about that? Or am I getting that from
I
somewhere
do
else?
think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think Mike Michalowicz talks about
Yeah.
it there. And I actually have a story
Yeah.
that my husband was right after college, or actually he dropped out of college to work for a startup that was angel funded. And the stories he tells me about the spending there, like their money was no
Yes.
object, right? They were going out to $500 lunches on a regular basis. It wasn't their
Yes.
money.
Yes.
And then many years later he started his own company, very different decision making on
Mhm.
like what are we willing to spend money on or not
Yes.
when it's your own money,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Such a different perspective.
It's that free money feeling. And as you
Yes.
said, debt is easier to get now, especially with like online applications and whatever and credit
Hmm.
cards. A strategy that I see American therapists use a lot, which I don't think is so available to us in Canada, is also like the interest-free credit cards, where it's
Hmm.
just like,
Yeah.
oh, I'll just grab an interest-free credit card, put this thing on it. And sometimes I have seen people do that strategically where I see it happen when I do my enrollments, especially for like money skills for your practice owners, where folks are thinking, okay, if I do the payment plan, it's 10% more. If I put it on a credit card and I pay it down, like, and you can just get that card. Like it's so easy to get
Yeah.
a card with, a $15,000 limit or something. And
Yeah.
what I have seen is if folks are very thoughtful and intentional, they can pay it down, but also it makes it very easy to just accumulate more and more debt, right?
Yeah.
This easy availability of what feels like free money, even though it's not free money.
Correct. And when you're taking on debt, you are essentially spending tomorrow's money today, right?
Mm,
Or tomorrow, next month, next year, but
yeah.
you're spending it in advance
Yes.
because you're going to have to pay it at some
Later.
point,
Yes.
right? So that's a little bit of the difference is the mindset shift between growing at the speed of cash really is we're saving in
Hmm.
advance and paying for tomorrow's expenses today,
Yeah.
right? Making sacrifices today to be able to afford
Mm,
next month or next year's expansion versus the opposite
hmm.
of we're spending it today and then we're going to have to pay for it
Yes.
at a later
Yeah.
time.
And
Yeah.
I remember seeing it would have been a blog article. I remember seeing a blog article in YNAB where they talked about how there's now this availability too of so many online checkouts have this. I think Klarna is one of the brands, like, where they break out
Yes.
the payments and you don't pay any more, but you pay it in 4 installments. The author talked about looking at like a blazer that he didn't have money for now. It was like, let's say a $200 blazer. And it's like, okay, he could buy it now and pay $50 and then pay $50 for the next 3 months. But he was like, if I actually save the money for it, will I want the blazer by the time I save the money? Like, will I still want it?
Ooh,
And he
right.
concluded that he actually wouldn't. If he actually had to set aside $50 a month of his own money and have that sitting in his accounts, and then had to make the decision, okay, now that I have the $200, do I still want the blazer? It's like by then the sparkly newness will have worn off. And that will no longer feel like the best use of that $200 once he has the $200 actually in hand, right? And it doesn't feel like free money,
Yeah.
which I thought was a
Yeah.
really concrete illustration of like, yeah, when you slow down too, you get out of that like shiny object kind of response because you
Yes.
kind of have time to sober up on whatever idea
Yes.
you're moving towards.
Well, and when we're talking about expansion specifically, right, in the context of a group practice, when there's a big difference there as well. When you are moving at the speed of cash, you are saving up in advance. And for a lot of our clients, and what I talk about in Profit First for Therapists is, if you save the money in advance, then you have X dollars to go spend. And it costs you, for example, 50 grand
Mm-hmm.
to go open up a new
Mm-hmm.
location. Okay, now we have 50 grand or maybe 40 grand.
Mm-hmm.
We start looking for a new
Yeah.
location, knowing that by the time we find it and sign the contract,
Yeah.
all that, we'll have 50
Yeah.
grand. Then you can go and pay for that expansion. But then you're in a situation where the income that your practice is generating on that day pays already for your expenses. So you don't actually need that new space to generate income from day one.
Mm-hmm.
But when you are using debt to finance that, really you're saying like, we know that when we borrow this money, we're going to start having to make those monthly
Yeah.
payments almost immediately,
Right.
right? Within usually 30, 45
Yes.
days, something like that. And so you basically immediately increase your expenses without necessarily having an increase of income right away. So there's a lot of ways that this can be beneficial. But so you're in that crunch and saying we're hiring, right? We're spending a lot of time and energy and often money to recruit new team members for this space. We're buying all the things that need to go in that space, the couches, then the tables and the, waiting room and all of that. And at the same time, our other expenses still exist, but there's not additional money to come in. Versus if you have saved up for it, this is how much money we have to spend. So when you're going out and buying those couches and chairs and all the equipment, you're making decisions a little bit differently, but you also know the practice is still paying for its own expenses. So we are okay.
Yes.
And so you can ramp that new space up in a way that is more intentional because you don't need the money on day one.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the huge amount of pressure that you end up creating by trying to create ease and kind of grabbing, money earlier. If you're not intentional about it, it's like, as you say, for this example, your new space needs to start generating maximum money right away, more money than you need to generate before, which is a huge amount of pressure to put on your business, on your team, on yourself. I could see that having a lot of costs, not just financial costs, but emotional costs to then have taken on this much larger debt burden, right? These payments that are now going to start to have to be made every single month.
And even when you are planning ahead, I think debt can always be the backup plan, right? I am a big advocate of group practices having a line of credit because emergencies will happen, right? Things will come up, and having a line of credit means that you're not going to the payday lenders of the small business for really, really expensive money, right? Where you have kind of this buffer, like, oh yeah, this payment didn't come through. We still have to make payroll, right? So, but the money will be here in a few days. But it's the backup and not the main plan. Because when you use it as like, this is the plan and you've maxed out that line of credit, if something happens, then there is nowhere else to go. Or the more desperate you are when you're looking at debt, the less those terms will be favorable for you, right? We often see emergency loans have almost a 50% interest rate, right? Loan shark style interest rates. And once you do that very first one, it is such a hard hole to get out of. It is so hard to get out of that. I've seen it more times than I can count over the last, several years, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I've seen folks in that position before, and those loans are highly predatory. They're set up so that you can't pay it off early. Even if you do manage to find the cash, you're not getting out. And and the amount that you are charged is astronomical. And I think, what I'm hearing here is almost like debt is supposed to be your plan B. If you use plan B first and there's no plan A, you become very vulnerable. Right? Especially in a larger practice, as you're talking about, where there's payroll and suddenly you need $15,000 because some, insurance payer stopped, which we all saw last year. Then you are going to people who do not care about you and are looking to basically wring as much money out of you as possible. So I'm hearing that is definitely a pitfall of folks, using debt up front. Is in some ways it makes you even more vulnerable to worse kinds of debt because you've already used kind of your healthier debt as your first move, and then your second move is terrible, right? Your options dry up very fast.
And when you are already in a tough situation, it's harder to get loans, right? So when things are not going well is usually not the time that your bank is like, oh yeah, absolutely, we would love to give you money, right? I know I am just going through a line of credit increase. I've actually never used my line of credit, but I still have one. And we're increasing it because the needs of the business are just different at this point. And it has been a month-long process just for an increase of a line of credit that I already have. Right. And so we're not in a desperate place. It's just more of a risk management tactic at this point. But if I actually needed that money, I probably wouldn't have a month to wait to get that loan. And that's how practice owners can get into hot water. And I talk about it from a group practice perspective. It's not that solo practices will never need debt or never incur debt, right? It's not that. It's just the numbers get bigger as we are in group practice. And there's more moving pieces, right? So if you are in solo practice and you didn't get an insurance check this week, it's a big deal, but hopefully you have a little bit of personal savings at home. Maybe you have a spouse that also works. And so it's not just a life or death situation. But if you have $200,000 in monthly payroll and $100,000 didn't come in, I mean, that is the livelihood of 10 plus people on your team, right? And so something has to they're a little bit more extreme situations.
Yeah, I think the principle that you're talking about is amplified in group practice.
Yes,
it's just
absolutely.
There's just so much more risk that you're taking in general as a group practice owner. More reward, but more risk, which means that if you run into a situation like this, it's going to be much more extreme. I'm curious, what other pitfalls have you seen private practice owners face when they start to grow their business on debt? Like, I'm hearing a few costs already. Are there other things that you also see?
Yeah, there's this narrative sometimes that the story that the business owners will tell themselves of, oh, but we're doing this because ... right down the road. Right. So we're incurring debt now, but it's because we're going to get this big contract.
Yes.
And the big contract will save everything. And in a lot of cases that will be true. But what if you don't get the big contract, right? What if you were laying this foundation for something that is never coming? And then what, right? Then it starts the spiral of debt.
Yes.
And so it can be a slippery slope. And we were chatting about that a little bit before we started recording. But what I come at accounting from a place of, with my family narrative, right? And I had a mom who started a lot of businesses and her businesses unfortunately all failed. I saw as a child how that affects everyone around the business owner, right? It's not just about, oh, my business failed. It affects the children, the community, the people who work in the business, right? There's so much downstream effect from that. And so I tend to be just a little bit cautious when I approach the money side of things, because that's how I feel comfortable with things. And so I'm not a particularly aggressive accountant. That's just not my style. I sleep really well by doing things that way, right? Like, I would always prefer to err on the side of my client being really protected and okay and ensuring the survival of their practice than being a little too aggressive and taking too many risks. And maybe it pays off, but maybe they lose their business in their house.
Totally.
Right. To me, that's not a gamble worth taking. For some people it might be, but for me, it's not.
Yeah. And I will say that narrative resonates with me as well, because I also my dad was a business owner who had a business that failed, a large business. And that knock-on effect, because, I've talked about this on the podcast a little bit before. I did an episode with Megan Meganson and Tiffany McLean talking about our dads in business and the stories you end up inheriting as a child growing up in an entrepreneurial household. And when my dad's business failed, it left my parents with $100,000 of debt in the 90s, which is a lot of money. It's a lot of money. And I do see the effects of that, not just financially, but also emotionally, like the kind of resentment that can be around that. And in my family, it ended up being fine in the sense that we had other folks in the family who had financial stability, who are my grandparents, who interestingly were completely debt adverse. Like, I think my grandparents had a mortgage for all of 5 days when there was the gap between selling the farm and the money showing up from the farm and paying off the house in town. And my grandfather was losing it for that whole time. He was the opposite, so tight, so conservative, never opened the purse strings. But there can be a huge impact. And I think this is where there's this balance point, because the other thing that I do find myself talking to my students about is kind of the opposite perspective of this, which is debt can be strategic, or at least it's not bad. If you have it already, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not shameful. You didn't mess up. This is your financial situation you're sitting with, and it can be managed thoughtfully. But what I'm hearing you talk about here, and what you're definitely pinging me into, is that if we are too casual about it, though, if we're not thoughtful, if we're not even regarding the speed of cash, we're just trying to move as fast as we possibly can, that we can really paint ourselves into a corner when it comes to debt. And I'm curious what you've seen with that, where folks, when it really starts to kind of spiral out of control for folks in private practice.
Well, so what I have seen happen, there's a lot of different scenarios that can happen. But one thing that I've seen often is oh, I grew my practice from 0 to 1 million. Surely I can double it again. Right. And absolutely that's possible. But what often happens is in that 0 to 1 million, lifestyle has increased as well. Right. If you're making a lot more money in your practice, you should get to enjoy some of that, right? Zero shame for that. But often what we see at that point is like, but they're not willing to make any sacrifices at all on that.
Yes.
And when you're growing a business, it's very normal to make less money. And it's something that I talk about often and that we try to prepare our clients for. Like, hey, in this 6 to 12 month period after you're opening a new location, there's a really good chance you are going to have less profit.
Yes.
And we know that, right? Let's go in knowing
Yes.
that and prepare for that so that when we're in it, we can remind ourselves like, oh yeah, we're in that hard part, but we're doing this because then later we're going to make more money. But if the practice owner is still trying to live exactly the same life and take out every single penny they can from the practice, they can paint themselves into a corner personally and professionally in the business where they're like racking up credit cards and then coming to a meeting and say like, hey, I have like 20,000 in credit card debt that I need to pay off. Like, can I take more money from the business? Like, wait a second. What happened? You can't. There is no money for you to take right now because we're in this period,
Yes.
right? So then that will just keep growing and snowballing.
Yes.
And then there's riskier and riskier loans on the business side at that point. And so it can just make for a difficult situation, right? So it's always okay to say, hey, at this point of the business or in my life, I want to take as much money as I can out. And so I'm going to choose to just keep things where they
Yes.
are right now.
Yes.
That's super
Yes.
valid. It's super valid to say my home life and the expenses I have at home are more important right now. So we're not going to make changes. But when you're going into that period of growth, there are some sacrifices to be made generally, right? Both financial and in time. It's unreasonable in most cases to think that you're going to double your business and that you're not going to have to work a little bit more in it, right? Like that you're going to, work 4 hours a day and golf every Friday. Like that's probably not the case if you're doubling your business. So kind of thinking about those things helps you look at reality as well of what does my life need to look like for this to be true? And am I willing to make those sacrifices?
Yeah. I mean, the word that's coming to me here is a phrase that I use when I talk with especially my group practice students, but also my solo practice students, is having that big picture perspective. And I think the concept of moving at the speed of cash is big picture perspective. It's like the money's coming, but it's not here right now. So rather than making this purchase today, I'm going to make this purchase in a year and I'm going to save $4,000 a month. And then by the time I get there, I'm going to have $50,000 almost to work with cash. So that's big picture perspective. But what I'm also hearing here too is having that perspective and self-restraint in terms of we're going from A to B and things are going to be harder in the middle, but we're doing this for a reason. But sacrifices have to be made, right? I can't expect everything to look the same when I'm also trying to make these huge changes in my practice, right? And it's like having that zoom out to be able to see it will be worth it. But right now, things are going to be harder, or there's going to be, as you say, less profit available, and the numbers are not going to look the way that I want them to look. But if you're working a plan, then they will look how you want them to look 6 months or a year into that new situation. And I think that those can be hard skills to build for people to have that big picture perspective and think about maybe discipline and sacrifice. I don't know. I there was a part of me that wanted to say, I don't think that those are big parts of our culture in North America. But then I also know certain folks really are self-disciplined and self-sacrificing almost to a fault. If I think about like my grandfather, for instance, but he was from, a different generation. They saw the Depression, that was a different time. But I am curious, like, why do you think this can be challenging for folks to have or develop these more zoomed out perspectives? Like, why do we even have to have this conversation about moving at the speed of cash?
I think we are now in an era in our culture where we want things now. We know what we want and we want it now, and we're not often willing to wait, right? I'm 100% guilty of that. But there's this kind of immediacy to the Amazon Prime culture, right? Of like, oh, you can get it tomorrow, right? I was just telling my kids yesterday, back in the day, right, if you wanted something, it's if you wanted something, sometimes you had to wait until Christmas to get it, right? And there wasn't like, oh, let's just order it and it'll be here in 2 days. That wasn't a thing. And I think we have become like that to some extent as adults as well, right? Of like, oh, well, if I did that in 3 years, maybe I can do it in one, right? And like, let's just see. And I think there's a very big difference between growing a practice from 1 to 2 million over 5 years than there is in doing that in 1 year, right? Basically, everything's going to break. Everything needs to be reinvented. So like, it always is possible. If you want to grow your practice, it's always possible. But the speed at which you're trying to do it is going to have an impact on your cash flow, your cash needs, and your personal life as well.
Yeah.
And to think that's not going to be the case is not helpful, because then you end up mid project and realizing like, oh wait, this is not what I was hoping for.
Yeah. That culture of what it would be like immediate fulfillment or whatever. You know, I know that there's a more succinct phrase for it, but I do think that it's kind of like the Amazonification of life, as you say. And we just become more and more used to the fact that you can just get things instantly. And, you know, I would be interested in almost like zooming out and understanding this from, I think global production has a lot to do with it. Like we can just get stuff so easily now, and the availability of stuff that just wasn't available in previous generations, that there is this lack of patience. We're impatient. We want everything today. And sometimes, you know, I think there some good questions to ask ourselves are like, why? Why do you need to grow your practice in a year instead of 5? Like, what's the actual benefit of that? Because part of it too is, I think, often that fantasy of what it's going to be, right? We're really buying into the fantasy of, well, it's worth it for me to take on this debt to have this thing today because it's going to make my life so much better. And what I also think is true of so many things in life, including personal things that you can buy or personal experiences, but also business experiences, is once you get to a new level, you just kind of get used to it and it's your life, right? And there's certainly, I think, huge improvements that happen in our life between making $11,000 a year, which at some point in my 20s is what I made, and $100,000 a year, right? There's a huge difference in quality
100%.
between that range. But once you start to get kind of above those numbers, life doesn't get that much better once your basic needs are met. And I know there's debate about this idea. I've seen other folks debate that life does get easier and easier the more money you have. But I am curious about your perspective on this. It's almost like more of a philosophical question of, why and what is actually true about what makes life or business so much better. That's worth waiting for.
I think there's often this fantasy in group practice, like if I could just get it to this bigger size, then I will finally be able to work less.
Yes.
And it's often not about the size. It's about the systems that you have set up, right? There is a certain point where you can now afford to have admin, right? Where you're not doing that, right? Like, so there are some milestones where, okay, it's possible you're not doing that thing anymore, but you're still doing a lot of other things. And it's not usually about the dollar amount. It's really about how have you set things up? Are they dependent on you or not?
That's so true.
And this is something funny I hear often from solo practice owners. They say, well, I'd like to start a group because that's going to be passive income. And I cannot help but laugh because there is nothing passive about a group practice. It is so much work, right? But they sometimes don't realize that until they get in and like, oh, wait. I will also often hear from new group practice owners who say like, oh, I have 2 part-time clinicians. Can I stop seeing clients? Like, no, you cannot. Absolutely. There's not enough revenue coming into this practice for a full-time administrative person, right? But like just of that expectation of what it actually is going to be and what it's going to take to actually do those
Absolutely.
things.
Yeah. And, you know, it makes me think about, you know, this kind of like larger piece that I was trying to get at is it's more about the how rather than the what is what I'm hearing. So it's like we have this fantasy of when this, then this. But it's usually more about how you're actually managing your schedule day to day. Are you taking the time to take care of yourself? Right? Like, are you prioritizing things that actually matter to you that you could be prioritizing now and you don't need to be at XYZ point to be able to go for a walk at lunch or like meet up with your best friend or take the day off early to go see your kids play? Like, those things are often available to us way sooner than we think. But there is this fantasy that once we get here, then it's going to be, it's almost like once we get here, then our behavior will magically change. Because that's what actually needs to happen.
Oh my gosh,
Is it's your behavior needs to change and your systems need to change or your way of relating to things needs to change. It's not actually about the dollars or the numbers. to, again, once we're past that certain point where your basic needs are met.
Right. Basic needs are met. And I think there's definitely an opportunity at any size of practice to build in the things that are important to you.
Yes.
Right. And it's not like what is important to everyone else. Like for me, I have school age children. I love going to the bus in the morning and in the afternoon. I love that because my kids are very chatty at that time of day. And so that's something that I prioritize. Yeah. It's on my schedule. It actually doesn't take a whole lot of time, but most days of the week I go to the bus twice a day because I love it so much, right? But like, that doesn't need to be something that's a big milestone in the future, right? And so some days I work a lot longer than I should, but I make time for that one thing that's super important to me. Yes. And then I've had that moment of connection with my kids, and then I go back to work and I do the things, and like, that has been my win, right? So like it's not a specific dollar amount that magically changed all of that. It's just, how do I organize my day in a way that I can make that possible?
Yeah. And I think it's owning that that's really important to you and actually prioritizing it, not letting it fall to the wayside because some random person wants to have a meeting with you to network at that time, which is obviously not more important than your kids.
Guess what? It's blocked. It's not available.
Yes, you've defaulted towards what actually matters to you. And I think there's so much wisdom in that. And I think that applies to private practice. It applies to our lives. Like, make sure that you're actually, even if it can only be incremental, you're incrementally bringing in the things that matter to you now and not thinking that some magical point on the horizon is where you're going to start living the life that you want. Because a lot of living the life that we want is about habits and discipline and like sticking with it. And those things don't just show up when you have a certain net worth at all.
And it does take some money in some cases, right? Some of it takes money, but if the goal is, I want to take a vacation once a year with my kids, like, okay, I think that's great. Or my family or my spouse or my best friend. That doesn't require millions of dollars to do that, right? They might be, for now, more modest vacations, and then later fancier vacation, right? But like it's not, if we don't do a $20,000 vacation, it's not worth it, right? Like it absolutely is worth it. Like, how can we make this happen now? We've digressed completely
so far
from our topic.
Okay, let's come back. Coming back to this, moving at the speed of cash, like manage money effectively. What are some strategies that therapists can use to not fall into these debt traps and to avoid taking on so much debt that they do create a problem? What do you suggest?
Yeah, I think planning is the big one. So just by planning, even if you're going to use debt, I would still encourage planning. Like, okay, if we're going to take out a $5,000 loan, how are we going to use this money wisely so that we can make our money back, right? Plan it in a way, is it going to generate income for the practice? And then what's the plan for paying it back? How are we going to make those things happen? If there's no plan to pay it back, then why are we doing this? And if it's not going to help us generate more money, then why are we doing this, right? And so there's a big difference between getting a loan of $5,000 to hire a really key person on the team versus to buy new furniture, right? The furniture is not generating income. A person generally is, right? So just sitting down, looking at what other alternatives are there as well. Is there another way for us to do it? Can I wait 2 or 3 or 6 months? Is there a payment plan, right? If maybe you're thinking about making a big investment for your business, maybe that is working with a coach like you, Linzy, that is absolutely can have a huge return on investment for your practice. But if you can't afford the full payment today, can you do a 3 or 6 month payment plan? Like maybe that makes sense. And then you are at that point moving at the speed of cash. Yeah, it's going to be a little more expensive typically. But you are doing it in a way that makes sense for you and that is not putting you in a difficult situation. So that's kind of how I like to think about it. And the third piece would be, do I really need to do this now? Is this a decision where if we don't make it today, it will never come back again? Is it truly that? Or will there be another opportunity in the future that we should wait to be more financially prepared for? I just think, my philosophy is that as a business owner, your primary responsibility is ensuring the continued success of the practice, that the practice survives, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of the decisions that you have to make are in the spirit of, is this in service of the practice surviving or not? And so that applies to so many different decisions, right? If you are paying someone more than you can afford, is this in service to the practice long term or not? Right? No, it's putting us in this hole that we're going to have to dig out of. We're better off not making this decision because the goal is for the practice to continue to operate successfully and profitably.
Yes.
Because that means it keeps serving the people that it serves.
Yeah.
It is in service to you. It is in service to your clinicians, your clients, your community, to everyone around you.
Yes. That big picture perspective.
Yeah, exactly. That takes a zoom out again, right? Of like, it's not just about this one decision of, I really want to hire this clinician, or I really want this new office space that's gorgeous.
Yes, totally.
Does it support the survival of the practice? Yes or no?
Yeah, great. Beautiful. Julie, for folks who want to get further into your world, where can they find you and follow you?
Yes, I have a podcast called Therapy for Your Money, where all I do is talk about money topics for therapists in private practice. And so that's a great place to start. I also have an entire accounting firm. We serve practice owners across the United States, and you can find us, including a whole lot of resources, our blog. We have some courses and our monthly accounting services. You can find that at greenoakaccounting.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julie, for joining me today.
Thank you, Lindsay.
There are so many pieces to this conversation today that I would love to just like keep jamming on, but I am not going to record a 15-minute outro. But what Julie is talking about here with this moving at the speed of cash relates so much, as we were talking, to being able to zoom out and take perspective on your business and your life. And this can be so hard in the culture that we live in, this instant gratification culture. And also with the fantasy that more is always better. It can be very tempting to just go for what we want right away, to take on big debt, to do what we want right away. But it is often so much more strategic to slow down. And whether it's slowing down and waiting to take that course the next time that it comes around rather than this time, or as Julie said, saving up the money to do a build out on a new space before you move into that space, slowing down also lets you double check that this is actually what you want and actually what is good for your business. And by the time that opportunity comes around, or by the time the money's saved, maybe it's not actually going to be what makes sense for you anymore. But by slowing down, you give yourself the gift of being deliberate and thoughtful, which really is moving against the current of capitalism and this idea of endless growth and bigger is better. But also, as we mentioned, this kind of like Amazonification, which is way too long of a word, but you know what I mean, of our culture and this desire for instant gratification. So much here. And I love Julie's suggestion of, these budgeting skills of like deferring the purchase. I'm always a fan of the idea of the right thing at the right time. And I have that conversation with folks a lot when they're considering joining me in Money Skills for Therapists or Money Skills for Group Practice Owners of, is it the right thing at the right time? Just because something is right for you doesn't mean it's the right time. And sometimes something not being the right time is because the money's not available and you're going to put yourself into financial duress to try to make it happen now. But the money will be available in 6 months or a year when this opportunity comes around again. So lots and lots to think about here. I always love talking with Julie. You missed the part before we recorded and after where we just loved on each other for a while because I have so much respect for her. And likewise, she's a wonderful person in this very specific little pool that I'm in of helping therapists with money, and so appreciate her coming onto the podcast today. You can follow me on Instagram at Money Nuts and Bolts. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please tell other therapists about it, other health practitioner or coach friends that you have. We are having such specific conversations here, and it is so helpful for us when you tell the folks that you know will benefit from these conversations about the podcast. It's the best way for other folks to hear about us and be part of these conversations. Thanks so much for joining me today.